Welcome to Conversations from the Heart, honoring Andrew Cohen through our stories. My name is Daniela Wombacher. I was a student of Andrew's for 17 years, and for the past 9 years, I had the privilege of living and working alongside him. This series is a tribute to his life, his teaching, and the evolutionary fire he sparked in so many of us. Through these intimate conversations, we remember not only the man, but the depths of transformation he catalyzed in our lives. May these stories keep his legacy alive, honoring the sacred thread that connects us and allowing his voice to continue resonating through ours.
Hi,
So
Daniel.
welcome, Mike.
Thank
Hi.
you.
And thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Well,
It's
thank
the
you
third
for,
one.
yeah. Well, thank you for, for taking the time to put this together. I feel like what you're doing is very important for reasons we were just discussing before jumping on about keeping figuring out what it means to keep Andrew's legacy alive,
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, for me, it seems to be part of the grieving process because I feel like it keeps me sane to talk to people and connect with people that have benefited from Andrew and from his teaching. And I was just listening to one of his last teachings online was a teaching called "Consciousness Delights in Its Own Self-Recognition,"
Oh, yeah.
and I was kind of puzzled that this is exactly what I feel when I talk with people like you, when we kind of together enter that space that we shared around Andrew, and that is still available to all of us. And I think that's a good jumping off point. And
Yeah.
I would like you to start probably to tell me, because I don't remember, when did you meet Andrew and how did you meet Andrew, and how did this all unfold?
I met Andrew in 1995 at the Corte Madera Yoga Center. At the time, I was in my early 30s. Wow, so that makes this almost 30 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Wow, that's crazy. I was involved with another teacher at the time, very powerful American spiritual teacher, very different kind of teaching, almost in many ways, almost interestingly opposite of Andrew's teaching in many ways, but and yet still an authentic enlightenment teaching, which is interesting in and of itself. But it's a very different approach. And at the time, I had a little art gallery in San Francisco. I'd just become a sort of an entrepreneur, and I had a woman who was selling me jewelry that from India. Her name was Roberta Anderson, and I think a lot of people, I hope she's still with us. I don't know if she still is or not. She was older than me. She was a very nice woman, and she saw when she came into my shop, I had a picture of my teacher at the time and his two teachers up there in a sort of a little mini shrine behind like by the cash register that, she noticed, and most others wouldn't notice it, but she noticed, and she goes, "Oh, who's that?" So we talked a little bit, and she started telling me about Andrew. And then, at the time I was so into my relationship with my teacher. I've never been spiritually promiscuous, so I was with that teacher for 13 years. And I had kind of, like you do a little bit, especially when you're young, had this arrogant presumption that I've met the be all and end all, and I'm not really interested to go see other spiritual teachers. But the thing is, she had such a mature, deep understanding that I found uncommon about the student-teacher relationship and all that stuff. And she didn't think what I was involved in was silly at all. And she wasn't trying to sell me anything other than jewelry, So then she said, "Yeah, this is Andrew Cohen. He's my teacher. I've never heard of him." But I had always had this thing. It's like, if there's an enlightened person that's supposed to be around the neighborhood somewhere, I'm going to go see him, because I want to see everybody who is like that, because I was young and I was still definitely seeking. And so I went one night. She invited me, said Andrew's teaching at the Corte Madera Yoga Center, where he used to give pretty regular teachings for while he had the center in Marin. And the first night I went to see him, he just completely, like everybody's story, he just utterly blew my mind. And when I walked out of there that night, I was quasi non-functional for about 3 days. I was so blown out, both by the sheer transmission of spiritual power and energy and consciousness of just sitting in that room, but also intellectually, I was just completely floored by I had never heard anybody speak with that kind of articulation about the most subtle aspects of spiritual experience and depths that could only be, it's like only a person who's been to the North Pole can really tell you what it's like
Yeah.
there, right? You can read things and this and that, but there's a transmission from somebody who has been to the territory or who maybe
Yeah.
lives there, and but it was this art, and this is a sort of my nature also. I've always been more of an intellect, and then yogas, they talk about the devotional type and the this and the that, and I've always been more the Gyani,
Yeah.
the intellectual type. That's just me, and I got that was Andrew also. He really thought things through, and when
Yeah.
he answered a question, it was the end of the question. It was the end of the question. You didn't have that question anymore. It's like, oh, that's interesting. That's what he said. I wonder what so-and-so says. It just went right to the source of the question and it just snuffed it out with
Yeah.
insight, and I just was completely blown away. And it was that my wife at the time had gone with me, and we both looked at each other on our drive home. I never forget, we were driving back home across the Golden Gate Bridge from into the city. And we just both looked at each other and just said, well, this is what's missing in the teaching we're currently involved in, which was more, it was kind of Kundalini yoga, energetic,
Yeah.
it really focused more on the transmission than anything else, not so much on understanding.
Yeah.
That teacher of
Interesting.
mine, a former teacher of mine was one, it's like, you don't want to look for understanding in the mind. The mind is full of bullshit and contradictions, and its intellectual analysis always falls short of just surrender. He was just very much, this is just you need to have spiritual experience and Kundalini Shakti over and over and over again, and the energy itself will work through your system. There's truth to that, but I
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
realize it's profoundly limited as well.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that in Andrew it kind of came together because as you
Right.
describe it, it was not only the
It
intellectual
was it was
part,
both.
it came with the experience, and we all experienced that, and it was mind blowing.
Yeah. And that's absolutely, it just knocked me off my feet. It just knocked me off my feet. And it put me into a kind of crisis because I loved my teacher that I was with at the time. I loved him. Um, he had helped me in so many ways. And then I felt this kind of conflict, but it's like, and I went through this for a few.
Yeah.
So I also felt, my seeking and my relationship is with God, right? Ultimately, these different teachers come through your life as a kind of missive from beyond because something in you is seeking, so it attracts these.
Hmm.
So I said, I'm scared because I really don't want to risk my current relationship. And this is before I really knew too much about teachers' egos too, because I knew my teacher at the time. He was, he even though he'd never come out and say, you could tell he didn't like when somebody would go see another teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. I think almost all the really good teachers have that. No, it's interesting.
Maybe, maybe, and and it's just one of those things that would take a lot more years of maturing to really get a deeper understanding of. But anyway, so I didn't say anything to him. But at one point in 1996, in January of 1996, oh, I know what happened at the Corte Madera Yoga Center. Andrew and I were having some kind of exchange. He was letting me ask a lot of questions, and like he does with people just starting out,
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the
Exactly.
beginning, he would just let you ask your questions and he would never push back on you. So I had
Yeah.
gone to see him now 5 or 6 times. And I know, I remember asking him a question about, do you think, is life made up of, is it free will or is everything predetermined? Is it free
Mm.
will or is it destiny? And, he just looked at me. And again, this is one of those moments where he just killed the question, right? With like you remember the Gordian knot
Yeah.
from
Yeah. Yeah.
mythology, like the complicated knot that you're supposed to try to
Yeah.
figure out, untangle, and Alexander the Great came along with his sword and cut it in half. That was
Yeah.
like how Andrew answered questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
he said to me, Mike, what difference would it make to the next decision in your life if you knew the answer one way or the other? Is it fate or is it all freedom and choice? What difference would it make in the next decision in your life? Right. And I was like, you're right. Absolutely none. because you still have to
Yeah, yeah,
act. Whatever the case is, you still have to act as if you're making choices.
yeah, yeah,
That
exactly.
kind of the end of the story. You know, even if you think it's all predetermined, nothing I can
Yeah,
do, you still have to make a choice. Do I go on a date with this one or don't I? You know?
yeah, yeah.
Um, and then after that, he said, so Mike, I've been answering your questions for some weeks now. So when are we going to get down to the man-to-man part of this? Why are you asking me all these questions? Is this just some kind of spiritual entertainment for you? And,
Mm,
you know, at that point, and, you know, this is a skillful teacher, right? She had
yeah,
let me be there long enough to get that transmission again and again and again. And I'd had some interviews with him privately too. So there was a little connection forming between us, right? And so he
yeah,
got a sense of me. He knew there was a connection. I could feel the connection with him. I didn't have enough in me yet to really respond to it. But that moment changed that, you know, and he said, when are we going to get to the man-to-man part of this? And then he said, we're having a retreat in India in January. Why don't you come? But he kind of threw it down as a challenge. Like if you
yeah.
don't, then, you know, I'm not gonna keep
That I
entertaining
don't take
you.
you seriously, no?
Yeah, right. You know, I've
Yeah,
been entertaining you because that's the stage we're at,
yeah,
right? But now it's like, when are we going to get to the man-to-man part of this? And that changed everything. Again, that was like,
yeah,
okay, you got to just ask yourself, this guy's not playing games. Are you? You know, are you? And I felt like it was kind of God putting that question to me, or the absolute. I mean, I use that word God not in a sort of a theistic
hmm,
sense necessarily, but just because it's a placeholder for the big idea, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
um, and so I went to that retreat in Bodh Gaya, and that was,
Mm,
you know, it was 3 weeks. So these were long intensives. There was no evolutionary dimension really to the teaching at that point. It
yeah,
was all about just the experience of enlightenment and and reframing your perspectives in the wake of the experience of that kind of knowledge, you know, of the absolute of this inversion of perspective that everybody basically had when they spent any kind of time with Andrew. And that's what happened when I was in Bodh Gaya. After 3 days into the retreat, I had like the biggest kind of enlightenment experience, episode, opening,
hmm,
whatever you want to call it, of my life, and more so and more sustained. And it was fueled by insight, not just by energy.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
you know, and that started a pretty major crisis in my life, because that forced me to confront my relationship with my other teacher. And at some point, a
yeah,
couple of more years went by, and I was growing frustrated with what I thought were the limiting nature of the teachings of my previous teacher. And I was talking to Andrew about it. And then again, you know, once in a while he poses these questions that just face you with a direct challenge. And he just said, well, perhaps your teacher's not meeting you in your interest.
mm,
And that really just hit me like a hammer blow, because because I had talked to my teacher. I said, look, I want more. I want to be pushed more. I want to go deeper. I don't want to be just come to meditation classes and hear the lectures. I want something more. And I want, you know, and then your teacher pushed you. I'm ready for that from you. And he goes, I don't do that with people anymore. I've been burned too
yeah,
many times when I tried to do that with people. And he didn't want to do that. And you know, now seeing what Andrew went through, good and bad, you know,
yeah.
you could understand why. Because for the most
He
part,
might have been a wise man, huh?
saved himself a lot of trouble. He's still teaching.
Yeah,
Just looked him up.
yeah,
He's still teaching in New York. Um, but that really hit me. And then I went to a retreat in Les Cormettes in France.
yeah.
And after that, I decided, and so things came to
That
head with
was the
my.
one that you wrote the book about, yeah?
No, that was in Montserrat. That
Oh,
was
that
in
was in
2000,
Montserrat.
that was
Okay,
2005 Montserrat.
okay.
Les Cormettes was probably, I don't know, 2001, 2002,
Hmm,
something like that.
hmm,
And that's when I decided I need to make a break. And it was extremely painful for me to leave
yeah,
my other teacher. It was extremely difficult and
hmm,
painful, but it was the right move. And again, and I was like, okay, ultimately I'm not looking for just a relationship with a human being. I'm looking to deepen my own pursuit of this mystery. And
yeah,
it doesn't, and I think Andrew's right. That teacher's not meeting me in the interest. It's I need to go, I want to go further, and Andrew shows the way. And then so, you know, we talked a little about that, and then he said that thing to me about, it's great, I'd love to have you part of the teaching, but you know, at that point in time, it was all in or nothing. And he said,
yeah,
prepare to have your whole life taken away from you. You know, so, and I think I said this in that other podcast that I did, you know, it's like he wasn't joking and I knew it and it scared the crap
No,
out
it
of
was
me.
not.
He was not joking. I mean, there's these few moments, you know, there's a lot of times where he would engage with you and it would be light. And, you know,
Yeah,
he would answer your questions, but it would be playful and light. And there's other times when you know, okay, this is the real moment between the guru and the teacher. It's like this is you have to drop all the facades and you just have to answer the existential question straight up because
yeah,
he's bringing you exactly who he is, so you owe it to him to bring him exactly who you are, so you got to drop it all, at least in this moment here, and then you got to reckon with the consequences, you know. And that I did that, and then on the one hand, I left my teacher. On the other hand, I didn't leave my wife. I didn't leave my business. I stayed in California. But this was before there was practitioners or anything like that. There was either you were a course student or you weren't any student.
yeah.
But he kept in touch with me. He never
But,
dropped. I always would go see him at public teachings. I always, to introduce my sister to him. She had an outrageously powerful spiritual experience that lasted about 3 months. And he really, he called her up at her house to see how she was doing after the big enlightenment opening. That she was in
mm,
that state. She basically lived where he lived for about 3 months,
mm,
and then, and then it kind of dissipated. And then I asked her once, well, what happened? She said, pride. It's all pride. I thought I had
yeah,
attained something. And
yeah,
anyway, and then so, a few years went by. Andrew always kept the thread with me. That's why I know he always knew we had a thing, but that wasn't I couldn't engage at that level, but he didn't throw me away,
yeah.
you know. Life,
No, I think he loved and respected you deeply. From all I heard him say about you, it was very clear that he thought
well,
very highly of you.
and the feeling was always mutual, and I didn't never turned on him.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, that's kind of how I met Andrew.
Yeah, but then you became a course student, yeah? You
Yeah,
were a
so then the
course
teaching
student,
developed. I
but
think
you,
after
yeah,
July
exactly.
31st, was it
Yeah,
2001? The July 31st?
2001. Were you part there of the big eruption?
No. Um, but I think at that point, some practitioner groups had started to form. Yeah, I know
Yeah,
there's some overlap there. I think they had started to, I think because of people like me, I think there was more and more people like me who really wanted what Andrew had to give, but weren't going to we're not the monk types. And,
yeah, yeah,
and, I remember not long after that on a retreat, they started to create discussion groups, and I saw how,
yeah,
and that was my first taste of the collective dimension of the enlightenment that we were doing, and I was blown away because to know that it started with 6 months of intense work of only the most committed people, and many of those guys flamed out because it was too much, understandably.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
6 month silent retreat with no end date. If you've ever been on a 10-day silent retreat, you know how intense those things are. 6 months,
Yeah, but
no
we
end in
we
sight.
we probably have to explain that a little bit clearer for people that hear this for the first time, because Andrew literally took people, students of his, and pulled them out of their workplace, out of their normal daily lives, and put them in indefinite meditation retreat in Fox Hollow. And they were just meditating all day long, and then they had discussion groups.
Yeah, the only instruction for the discussion groups, as I understood, was make something happen.
Yes, exactly.
Make
And
something
that
happen.
went on for months and months and months until it erupted on 30th July 2001.
In all this gets left out. This is something we talked about in our previous discussion. This gets left out. The commitment of those people.
Yeah,
Just anybody who's listening to this, think for a minute about what that takes. That your teacher calls you, you're living, I don't know, in Australia. People were all over the world. Some of them
yeah,
had
yeah,
families, some of them had maybe not families per se, but a girlfriend or a boyfriend and a job, all the things we have. And it's the message comes from your teacher, give it up right now and get over here. And if you don't want to, if you can't do it, then then I don't know where you're at in the teaching, because this is where my serious students are, and it's like,
yeah,
and then they just had 6 months. I still to this day, I cannot get my head around that they did that, you know.
yeah. It's absolutely amazing.
And then it happened. And it wasn't just an imaginary, fantastical thing, because then once that flame erupted, it's like a little match lit on fire, but you can use a match to start a forest fire. Andrew always used that metaphor, right? But that match needed to get started. And that's what
Yeah.
that 6 months was. It was like striking the match again and again and again until it finally,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. And then
And it feels like something was created in consciousness at that point that then later on was accessible. No, I wouldn't say easy. Even today, it's not easy, but it is accessible with much less effort. You don't
it's,
need 6 months of meditation. It
correct.
it is right there right now. And
Yeah.
I have had experiences with groups of relatively new people, spiritually on the path people, but that hadn't done the intersubjective dialogue work, and it exploded between them like this.
Well,
So
I
for me,
think
it's pretty clear that something has been created at that moment that that was a real creation, that was an
that's correct.
emergence that is now available.
That's correct, and it's still available. And that's when I realized, like, okay, here I can participate now, because and
Yeah,
also Andrew was starting to create structures to accommodate people like me more, and also he
yeah,
knew that somehow this can't just be some little experiment at Fox Hollow. You got to bring people who have, I had a serious interest. I just didn't have that level, and also I don't know if it was my karma. I don't know what factors are that work into these decisions, but it didn't feel like the right, it would have been felt like a completely inauthentic move to me to move over there at the time, and I would have flamed out like so many other people, because I
yeah,
just would have been too much.
yeah,
But now it wasn't. And also that's the thing that I saw, this whole hundredth monkey effect, where
yeah,
where
yeah,
where all of a sudden these people who just nearly killed themselves to bring this into being, um, now is available to the rest of us. You
yeah,
know, again, like you said, not without effort. I mean, we all made a big effort, and we all got burned up in the effort. Sometimes, when it was our ego that was creating a problem in the room. But that's when I said that's what I want to participate in. I want to be a link in that chain. I want to be,
yeah,
the match is lit, but now other people have to burn. You
yeah,
know.
yeah. Can you describe a little bit how you experience these groups so that people can understand what the practice actually is, which was a real practice in Andrew's community and still is. I mean, we practice it intensively now in his second coming, up to his death 3 weeks
Well,
ago.
it was a developmental thing. I didn't have any idea what the hell we were trying to do when we first time we started these discussion groups.
Yeah,
So a lot of it was just experimentation. And again, people like myself and others who, like, if we go, for example, on a weekend retreat at Fox Hollow, there might be 200-300 people there, right? And
yeah, yeah,
none of us had any experience with this. So, and also I think the people who were guiding the groups also had very little experience. I mean, they had experience with each other, which was a group of intensely committed, like, again, Navy SEALs. They're all
yeah,
intensely committed to each other, and they know what they got to do, and no hesitation, right? But I don't, they needed to figure out how to work with us. And
yeah,
so,
yeah, exactly. But I mean, the basics was and is that you want to come together beyond ego here. Like, if
correct.
we want to simplify it really, really
No,
deep
that's
down,
exactly
it's
right.
just it's a practice beyond ego. People
It's a
meet beyond
practice
ego.
beyond ego, and that was the really hard part, because there was
Yeah,
people in the
exactly.
group always, who had a lot of experience of practice beyond ego, and there was a lot of us in the group who had pretty much none,
Yeah,
and also who still didn't realize, and I definitely include myself in this category, how much of your spiritual seeking was just another expression of your own ego.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, it was mixed up. There's always an authentic impulse to seek, but you know how the ego wraps itself around everything, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so I remember when we first started, like, just simple things like just learning to feel in the group when what somebody said was coming from ego as opposed to something else, this other dimension that we were all trying to. And it wasn't about intellectually analyzing it, as I said, but feeling where it came
Mm, hmm.
from. That was just so new. And at the end of the day, I thought about the instructions that we developed over time. Over a year or two, there was a list of instructions that started to develop, like what kind of attitudes and postures facilitate this kind of thing. And the first one was listening.
Yeah.
Duh. These are like basic, and you can see how lost we all are in our own egos when we just have everyday conversations with people. How often are we actually listening?
Hmm.
Andrew was right, and he pointed this out over and over and over again. So did his senior teachers. Most of the time we're listening for an opening to throw our thing in.
Yeah.
So, and then in the groups, it was pointed out when you do that, that's why it falls flat in the group because it's not in the flow. It's coming from your own brain. So I remember Jeff, who was like a master at facilitating these things.
Yeah. Yeah. He was.
I remember when outside, he said one thing, it just for some reason struck me in terms of the kind of the renunciate discipline you had to do with your own mind in these groups where you could, you have to have the training to see your own ego and feel it arising and then just disregard it, the meditative
Yeah.
practice. That's where it all
Yeah.
came together, right? And he said, if there's something in a conversation and you feel an opinion come up that you've said before, drop it.
Forget it. Forget it.
That's
Exactly.
not it. That's old and
Yeah.
dead, and it's just coming from
Yeah.
the attic where all you store all your opinions that you're just waiting to trot out at an
Yeah.
appropriate moment in a
Yeah.
conversation. So just drop it. And of course, that brings you into a vulnerability. It's like you want to know, and it took me a long time. It took everybody a long time, I think. You wanted it's got to be more spontaneous, where you can't kind of plan it, and it's a direct response to something somebody's saying, not to
Yeah,
your.
because in the end, it's not your small self that is in conversation, but the idea is that the authentic self, the big self, that is the same in each and every one of us, is having a conversation with itself.
But it's
And when
to
you
all of
achieve
us.
that, then the
when
beauty
that when
arises.
that happens when that
Yeah,
happens it's, oh my God, it just
yeah,
blows the lid off, because the most blown out
exactly.
enlightened state that you ever had by sitting
Yeah,
in front of the teacher is now you're having with the group, and
yeah,
this incredible sense of like you all know you're in it together, you all know,
yeah.
and everybody knows there's a precious field, and that we all gotta, because and this is what we discovered again and again and again. One person comes from a little bit of their own ego and it crashes the whole thing
Yeah,
immediately, because it's so delicate still. It's such a new emergence. It's so
yeah,
delicate. And at different times, it was any of us would do that, and then you'd have to, and
yeah, yeah,
then the person facilitating the group would just, have to look at the group and like say, can you feel what just happened? And of course, you were
yeah,
the last one who spoke. You're like, oh shit. But this is where
yeah,
like that's when spiritual maturity, humility, seriousness, all this stuff come together, because at that point you're always, and so many people couldn't deal with it. When you're challenged, it's like, okay, this is a person who's telling you this, who you've acknowledged in the past has more insight than you do. So you need
hmm,
to just take it on board. And yeah, and just at least start from the presumption. This is something I learned from my first teacher. Always start from the presumption you're wrong,
yeah,
um, and that they know something you don't. You might not be, but start there, because then you have room to explore. So that was always the challenge, the existential, and not lose your mind emotionally in the moment when you feel maybe you've been humiliated. The whole group
exactly.
crashed, everybody's looking at you, and then all the defenses go up. And that's the egoic
Yeah,
training, right? Because then you got to, in
yeah,
that moment, you have to have the wherewithal through your meditation practice, your celibate practice, and all this stuff. These things weren't ends in themselves. They were to facilitate this.
yeah, yeah,
The dropping of all that in an instant.
yeah,
And then when you could do that, then it wouldn't take very long for the whole thing to rise up again.
exactly.
And so, and most of these groups were like an up and down of that, but the up and down was important because you can feel the difference. You could start feeling into it. You could
Yeah,
start feeling when things popped. Oh my God. Then you're
yeah,
just like we talked the other day, this experience of this, whatever, the self-absolute authentic self of that power in capital letters,
yeah, yeah,
in the room, not just talking to itself through a bunch, but also discovering more about its own nature, about its own
yes,
reality, and about these new potentials that were new to even that power in this reality. And that's when you felt like you were just completely on the creative edge of the universe. You're
yeah,
literally with the power that created the universe, exploring potentials even it isn't yet aware of, that it's intuiting, just as you're intuiting them, it's intuiting them, and you're pushing together towards that. And in terms of a mission for life, I mean, there just was never anything greater that I experienced than that. That you got, because then it was also not very difficult to see how this finally made the link for me philosophically about the connection between your own freedom, enlightenment, whatever, however you want to frame it,
Yeah, yeah.
and the evolution of the world. Because pretty much enlightenment, spiritual practice, it's been an individual endeavor, pretty much forever. The individual gets enlightened. It's amazing. The individual is
Yeah,
liberated from this world, to be free from it forever, not to participate in it fully,
exactly.
right? And that's when you just saw all of these philosophical traits, all of it just came together right there in these radically clear, radically transcendent moments, and this experience of being with people where on the one hand, you and I'd be sitting here talking just like we are, and I can see where your body is, and you can see where my body is, and I can see that, your mind is like this, mine is like this, and everybody else. But at a felt emotional level, you really couldn't tell where you ended and the other one began.
Yes.
Um, that
And
was
at the same time, you still could feel the Mikeness or the Danielaness coming
right,
through this oneness. And that for me is so puzzling and so amazing, because you are not losing who you
right.
are as a manifest
You're
person. In
affirming the
contrary,
duality of your own existence, the
yeah,
existence as an individual, separate, unique individual,
yeah,
and the primary existence of that as
yes, exactly.
the source and the binder between all of us and everything, and
Yeah,
that power is going somewhere. That it
yeah,
wants to go, and this is always the thing, and it wants to go somewhere, but it can't. God's not. God might be omnipresent, but not omnipotent. He needs
yeah.
he, she, it, that
He
needs
needs,
conscious co-participants to make
yeah,
this happen. And that was like, I mean, I could never think of a greater mission to have in life
yeah,
than to somehow facilitate that. I mean, to me, it was just, and I think all of us that were there felt that way. That, when you really got that hit of what I'm describing, it would leave you changed forever. It would change your entire moral, ethical orientation to life, not to life, capital L, all of it, your personal life and your spiritual life was just completely
yeah,
transformed. And
yeah,
that's what I remember the most about Andrew. And this is again in the narrative, this is what gets left out. And all of those people who look at us and go, "Well, you guys were in a crazy cult, man. What's wrong with you? Did you not, did your daddy not love you or something?" Um, and this is what gets left out.
yeah,
And I
totally.
think in terms of a lot of the bitter students who left before all this happened, and I think Andrew said this a lot, they went through all the difficulty and pain and trauma of attempting to manufacture this kind of transformation, and they didn't get any of the benefit of it. They
Yeah,
only
yeah, yeah.
experienced
That's the tragedy.
the hell world. They only
Yeah,
experienced the hell world. And nobody who goes
yeah,
to hell and comes back says it was a fantastic place.
yeah, yeah. So true. Wow. Yeah, it is an amazing practice. I'm very curious also to hear a little bit about how it came that you wrote a book about that retreat that you attended, because I remember that I read the book. I was a very young student. I came to Andrew in 2008. When did you write your book?
I started, the retreat
2011
was in
or
2005.
yeah,
So it took me 3 years to write. So I started after the retreat,
yeah.
and I
That's right.
remember when the retreat was over, and just in the last session, and Andrew was walking up a staircase back to his room or whatever in the hotel we were in, and and there was a lot of hubbub and swore. You know how it is, the end of a 10-day retreat. It's just packed full
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah,
everybody wants a piece of Andrew. He's sort of protected by his senior students, so no, so that he doesn't get mobbed and ask, he can actually. And
yeah,
I wasn't up near the front there, and I was trying to kind of get his attention, and it just wasn't happening. So because I had this idea, and then he saw me, and then this is the thing with Andrew. It's like a lot of his people never took me that seriously, but he did.
mm,
So he saw me in the back of the
yeah,
crowd there, and he goes, he goes, just like, come on, waved me up and said to somebody who was standing next to him, maybe Rob or somebody, said, "Go get him,
mm-hmm,
bring him in."
mm-hmm,
And I want to see what he
mm-hmm,
wants. So a few minutes later, I was up talking to him, and I brought up the books, like, because I had always loved spiritual autobiographies, and I wanted to write one for a long time, like in a modern
yeah,
context.
Yeah.
that really took that student-teacher relationship and represented it in the streets of Manhattan, which where my first teacher lived,
Yeah.
and California and all these places. So I said that to him. One was called what was it? The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. I mean, now I look at that book and go, a little new agey, it wouldn't necessarily be my cup of tea, but it had a big impact on me at the time. And then I read Daughter of Fire, and then I read
Yeah.
Daughter of Fire, 900 pages. Every one of them blew my mind. So
Yeah.
I Am That, Nisargadatta's book, I Am That. And I told Andrew, I said, look, I always wanted to write this kind of a spiritual autobiography that really, and your teachings are so, and I said a lot of things. I said,
Hmm.
I really would love to be able to write about my experience of this retreat, but it would, and also in a way that really puts your teachings out there in front and center. Could I have all the transcripts from this retreat? Because they record everything,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then there's somebody transcribes them, right? So there's just reams of this stuff. And I don't remember if he said yes, but he pretty much said yes right then and there. He said, I think it's,
Yeah.
how Andrew was. Something hit him,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
he didn't have to think things through that much. Not like this. He just got a spontaneous hit that this felt like the right thing to do. And he gave me the okay. And I know that there were people around him who saying, "What? You're going to give all the transcripts from this retreat to that guy in California, that lightweight?" I mean, he's a nice guy and everything, but
Yeah.
and he did it anyway.
Hmm.
And so, that felt to me like, like I feel about the book that I'm working on, that felt like a kind of a spiritual mission for me. So I spent the
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
2 years working on that,
Amazing.
and then put it together, and then managed, and then this, and nobody's going to publish this, and then I got a publisher. And then, this is just, maybe this is just my own ego, just still griping a little about back in those days, but it was a relatively a solid say. It put Andrew on the map in a way. It
Yeah.
brought a lot of the next couple of retreats. About 50% of the people, when they were surveyed, what brought you, mentioned the book.
Yeah. Yeah. I can believe that because the book had a big impact on me too, because it was so well written and had so much transmission of what you went through during the retreat. It was also very, very vulnerable and authentically expressing what you felt, what you went through, what was difficult, what was wonderful. It was just, yeah, it's a great book still, I guess.
Well, I hope that somehow, as we put together, kind of a central place where, at least the best of Andrew's teachings is available digitally. Like I said, I want you guys to have my book. I want it up. It can be a free PDF download. I can get you all that stuff, because I have a feeling in future generations,
Hmm.
when all the things around Andrew that are negative, that and then the people who are, you know saying all those things, when that's all gone and all the challenge of Andrew as a personality isn't there anymore, and other people, like, I said this to you the other day, other young people who discover spiritual longing like we all did early on, um, and then start perusing the
Yeah,
web
yeah,
is at that point for teachers, will have a chance to come across this. And I think Andrew's teachings, I'm sorry, Andrew's books, I always thought they were underwritten. Um,
mm,
I mean, he was always into the sort of the clean Zen kind of, all his books, they're just like these, like Enlightenment is a Secret. It's just one little paragraph of insight on a page, But there was
yeah,
nothing
yeah,
out there that actually expressed it. And it was a lot of his books, Freedom Has No History. There are all these little things with just power teachings.
yeah,
But there was nothing out there at all that described what it was like to be with him as a in these
yeah,
things.
that's true.
And that living part of the whole student-teacher relationship, and that's something I always wanted to represent, was like, what's the student-teacher relationship look like in today's world? I'm not going to India to go pretend I'm Indian and wrap myself in orange robes and sit out at the temple in Tiruvannamalai as a white guy and with a begging bowl, pretending, to have a spiritual life. So what does this look like for people like us here in
Yeah,
our world?
yeah.
You know?
And how does it look like when you look back, the student teacher relationship? What are
Well,
the most important ingredients, I would say?
I think the most important ingredient is sincerity.
Yeah,
on both parts, really.
Yeah.
You know, it's astonishingly hard to find.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I what are the most important parts? What are the most important parts as the student approaching a teacher? Is that what you're at? What was the question?
Yeah, or no, just what is the most important ingredient for a student-teacher relationship to actually work as it is meant to work, that it's developmental for the student and probably also fulfilling for the teacher. I sometimes think we forget that the teachers, the gurus, are also human beings. And being so close to Andrew, what I realized was more and more, so many people objectified him in a way, you know what I mean? Whereas they didn't really see the human being that with his own needs also, and his
That's right.
emotions and his emotional reactions and everything. And so I find it an interesting question. How does the student-teacher relationship actually work so that it's good for both sides?
I think, these you could come up with long intellectual explanations, but I think it's really simple. Trust and surrender.
Yeah,
Trust and surrender ultimately.
yeah,
There's all kinds of little litmus tests, like when, it's like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
say, it's like in the beginning, when a student and a teacher first meet, that the responsibility is on the teacher to prove themselves to the student. I'm sure you've heard this before. The responsibility is on the teacher, and
mm-hmm.
and he used to say, and this was also my experience with I went to see lots of teachers. I only had relationships with two, but I went to see tons of them. But he said, something doesn't, and this was bold, something doesn't happen in the first meeting pretty quickly, that's not the one for you. Because the
Yeah,
real teacher, something's going to happen pretty quickly that's going to
yeah,
prove to you beyond a doubt about where this person is coming from, you know?
yeah,
And so the teacher may have to do that even a handful of times because there's all kinds of reasons not to trust people, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so, but at a certain point, and I think that was that moment when he said to me, at Corte Madera Yoga Center, so when do we get to the man-to-man part of this? Or am I just some kind of spiritual entertainment?
Mm-hmm.
That's when like he had it's been 5 or 6 times he had now proven himself. He knew. I wrote him
Yeah,
some
yeah,
and told him what I was experiencing after meeting him. And so then that's the next, and then it comes the other way, So then but I think trust and surrender at the end of the day and sincerity. Trust, surrender, sincerity, and some
yeah,
courage, willingness to be burned.
yeah, yeah. And funny enough, I resonate the most with trust of all the terms that you mentioned, because in my own experience, because this is all about ego transcendence, the one ingredient you need when it comes to kind of the end game, whatever that means, but or to real breakthrough, then when the ego really doesn't want to listen and really doesn't want to agree and really doesn't want to do what it should do, surrender to God, not to the guru, to God, to spirit, to the absolute, then only when trust is strong enough, that was at least my experience, that in the end, at that time, there were a few days that were crucial in my development with Andrew. I could only hold on to trust in him. That was the only thing that still was there. And everything rebelled, but the trust was there. And that in the end led to a breakthrough.
And love, I always, as much as
Yeah,
Andrew was hard, he was hard. There was something, when you met him in those moments when it was just you and him, and you were
yeah,
both in that state together. The foundation of it there was a kind of love there, and it
yeah,
was that kind of big impersonal love, but it was also personal.
yeah,
It was both, and I always felt that from Andrew, even when I didn't feel it from others.
yeah,
Um, so it's a love. I think love it's like you feel seen and loved in a way that is very uncommon. As if at the foundation, then all that is
yeah, yeah, yeah,
all that is tested later. How much love and trust is there?
Yeah.
And also, I guess this is the really hard, tricky thing. An ability and this is where the sincerity comes in, I think, the ability to take critical feedback
Hmm.
and analyze. I mean, you can't just say, "Oh, he said, I'm this way, I'm that way, so it must be true," but to actually, go looking inside yourself to see where that's true, why, when, how, um, it takes a lot. I think most of us are so conditioned to just automatically defend,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
exactly.
especially when it comes to these deeper, sensitive things, that have to do with your self-image, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
um,
very true.
Trust, surrender, love and trust, love and trust. I always felt like, and even towards the last couple of years when I thought he did some things that didn't really line up with all that, um, I always felt like, no, underneath all of that, whatever else is on this sort of intermediate or more superficial levels happening, underneath
Hmm.
all there's love, there's real love. None of this is malicious ever.
Yeah,
It's yeah. So I think that's trust, surrender, sincerity. Trust, surrender, sincerity, love. Those would be the
yeah,
words. Um, Vulnerability, courage,
yeah,
because you can be burned. You make yourself vulnerable, you drop your defenses, you can be burned.
yeah.
And even when the burning is like a burning up of stuff that needs to be burned up, it's still painful.
It's still painful,
It doesn't feel
exactly.
good because
No,
you know it. I mean, I know it anyway. And I mean, somehow I always had this knowledge that when you open yourself to the trust and the love, it's also because you're going to burn, and burning is
yeah, yeah,
painful. And in the
yeah,
pain, are you gonna, I mean, that's where there's so many beautiful things in Christianity about in the symbolism, even
yeah,
when
true.
Jesus was on the cross, Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah,
You know, he um he could have renounced God. Maybe they would have taken him down off the cross, whatever. I don't know. But he
yeah,
didn't,
yeah,
he didn't. And so this is a kind of a relationship that is not understood in the modern world, except, by those few of us who've been lucky enough to be in it and be burned by it. I think all of us, I mean, I know I've been burned. I know a lot
yeah,
of people have been burned. So, it's like you get close to the fire,
yeah,
you're going to burn. And so some of this stuff is going to, burning is painful. Even if the stuff that's being burned up is the stuff that needs to be burned up and turned to ashes in you, burning hurts.
yeah.
And which is why I always had a really big problem with all this kind of what my first teacher used to call blue angels with pink wings spirituality.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's all loving. I mean, people who talk like that really have no idea what they're talking about.
Mm.
Yeah, there's that dimension
Yeah,
of love absolute, of a kind of overwhelming love that you can be devastated by periodically, you know, but it's not, it's often, love burns too.
yeah,
And,
absolutely.
you know, um, well, anybody who, I mean, even in human relationships, love burns too. Um, but
It's
in this
interesting,
context,
and Andrew didn't like the word love so much. He often talked in the last years about that he loves the word trust much better than the word love, because he feels like love is coming and going, and people speak about the big love and then they forget about fall in love and fall out of love, and it's so non-reliable in a way.
well,
It's
right,
an interesting.
as an
Yeah,
emotion, but when you
yeah,
realize it as a state of being, as the deeper state of being of that out of which you arose,
yeah,
uh, uh,
that's true.
that's different. But yeah, but it's very, and especially in the new age circles, it's very wishy-washy
Yeah.
and soft and gooey, and it makes people, and also people like the word God and some other words, and people already think they know what it means. And so the
Hmm.
second you mention the word, then all these associations come up, and then suddenly you feel unloved because something harsh was said to you about that's probably true.
Yeah,
And you say, well, what does
Yeah,
love do with spirit? I thought it was unconditional love. And this is one of the things I love with many things that Andrew said, that he always poo-pooed this notion of unconditional love. And he differentiated it from absolute love, right?
yes,
But I think the most pithy thing he said is like unconditional love. What good is it? I love
yeah,
you no matter
exactly.
what. You're a serial killer and a financial fraudster and sociopath, but I love you anyway.
Yeah, it doesn't make
Where's the
any sense.
motivation to change? If love isn't a force for change, then
Yeah,
what's the point?
yeah.
Just a good
No,
feeling?
no. His way of showing love was to want you to evolve, to want you to
Right.
grow, to want you to develop, and that was also his attitude to himself. The Yeah, it's an evolutionary teaching. We want to grow. We want to.
And as a maturing spiritual seeker, you have to learn
Yeah,
that. If
yeah,
you don't learn that, you're never going to get far. You'll end up in some place where everybody tells you you're fine and just meditate. And if you're too stressed out, let's bring your blood pressure down, and
yeah,
let's everybody give you a big hug, and that's what most of these spiritual communities are like. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
And that's one of the reasons I was attracted to this, because this guy was not playing games, and and then you start to understand a different dimension of what love is.
yeah,
The love of in some way, the closest thing might be the love of a parent who sees that their child is doing really bad things in their life that are going to have lifelong consequences, and might do something drastic, like if they're 14 and 15 and running with the wrong crew, pull them out of school and send them to a military academy or something. It's harsh.
yeah,
you but it's because the parent understands, oh, this is where this is going right now. It's going to end really badly, and they have to do some
yeah,
kind of intervention. So I think that's what the guru is supposed to do. Where you're going right now is more ignorance,
yeah,
because everything in the world reinforces your ignorance.
yeah.
um anyway,
No, and
I
it's
just
also that
ramble on, but
Andrew's teaching always was focused on how you live your life. That how you live your life should be an expression of the teaching. So it never was an escaping the world. It was always about showing up in the world as a better person. Yeah.
yeah, well, which should be, and I think it is actually the aspiration of most spiritual paths, is to make us into better people. But there was a way, when you're involved with the it's like the difference between playing paintball. You know what paintball is, with the
Yes.
little
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the difference between playing paintball and joining the Navy SEALs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the,
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
a lot of stuff that I saw out here is playing at spiritual. Andrew had the great phrase. They were living the spiritual lifestyle. And Andrew was teaching the spiritual life, and that was really very
Yeah.
different. And
Yeah. Yeah.
once you read some of these books like Daughter of Fire, if your own sincerity is there, then that is what you're looking for. That's what I was looking for. And it scared the
Yeah.
shit out of me simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's endless numbers of people involved that had exactly the same experience. It's the most exhilarating and the most frightening thing you ever undertook.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Maybe
what it
like
is.
climbing Everest or something. I don't know. I don't know what a good analogy is, but I think that's, you asked about, what's my understanding of the essence of the student teacher thing.
Yeah. And I mean, it was also like the utopian aspiration. Like Andrew was a utopian idealist, and he set us all on fire with this utopian ideal. And a utopian ideal is dangerous in itself, and one has to see how to navigate it. But I still
Yeah,
feel like it's worth to have an ideal, a utopian ideal to strive for.
it's all risky business. This is the
Yeah.
other stuff. So because Andrew, we talked about this a lot during the day. Because the
Hmm.
Muslim terrorist also has a utopian ideal.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So we got to be, it's all tricky territory. It's all treacherous terrain. We're
Yeah.
we're 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 having to navigate the deeper spiritual forces in us as they intersect with the animal forces of our animal body and mind, and millions of years of evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, Aurobindo really nails all that. The animal looking to, what is it? I mean, maybe I said this the other day. Again, I'll paraphrase this. but it was Aurobindo. It's one of the most beautiful things he ever said, which is, um, what is it to you? What is man? Man is an axis upon which the world turns, in whom nature looks with animal eyes to her divine ideal.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, man is an axis. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it. I'm using this quote
Yeah,
in
yeah,
my book
yeah.
and write with some dialogue. But man is an axis upon which the world turns, in which nature looks through animal eyes to her divine ideal. I think I have never
Beautiful.
come across a phrase that in those few little words sums the whole thing up.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know, we're looking with animal eyes. Look, all of it, lust, murder, all the petty impulses, all the little egoic, self-protective structures
Yeah,
that
are
got
still here.
us to this point in evolution, which
Yeah,
people forget. We are the apex killers on the planet. That is why we're here being able to talk about goodness, truth, and beauty and things like that. Only
yeah,
the
yeah,
apex
yeah,
killers get to do that. Now, look at the irony of that cosmologically, right?
yeah, yeah,
The world is full of pain and suffering. It's the overwhelming quality of the experience of almost everything that lives is pain and suffering first. That's the Buddha pointed that out. Is
yeah.
the big underbelly. And then on top of that, you can have a glaze of something, of something better.
Yeah, and
uh,
what you're pointing to is also that it's us that is creating the values and the moral and the ethical guidelines that we want to live by. It's 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 not inherent in the evolutionary impulse or the impulse that has created the universe. This moral and ethics. I think it's a combination between this force and us actually create the appropriate values and morals as we go.
right. And but they're based on, and this is that goes back to the enlightened communication thing, but they're based on it's a vision towards unity. It's always the spiritual drive is
Yes.
always a vision towards unity.
Yeah.
So how do we get to through all this? And that's, spirit had to, and this is traditional, I think, Hindu teaching probably, that spirit involved itself in matter and became lost in it for a while, and then had to create sufficient complexity in the world of matter to create creatures like us.
Yeah.
And it's not human beings
To strive
particularly,
towards the light again. Exactly.
to have a sufficient cognitive wiring to start to be able to transcend all of our base impulses that got it here and then start to respond to this vision
Yeah.
in a way that my
Yeah. Yeah.
dog, lovely as he is, cannot do.
Yeah.
Um, and again, that's what we were all involved in. That's what we were trying
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
That's what Aurobindo was pointing to. I think Teilhard de Chardin also to some degree, although he wasn't. I mean, he couched things in different ways. Aurobindo was really the more the mystic. Um,
Yeah. You know what is very interesting? Andrew and I talked a lot about that. Here we live here in Tiruvannamalai, where Ramana Maharshi was residing, and Sri Aurobindo was only 2.5 hours away, and they lived at the same time. So they are contemporaries, yeah.
did they
And
ever meet? Do
they
you know?
no, they didn't, and they didn't like each other's philosophy. They did, now you have the two of the most enlightened people living at the same time, but they didn't agree with each other's interpretation of
Isn't
that
that
enlightenment.
interesting?
Isn't that? It's
So,
very interesting.
the similar thing happened when Andrew interviewed Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah, yeah.
So nobody denied ever Eckhart's extraordinary
No,
attainment and enlightenment. I met him several times at teachings he gave, and he was the only other one where that. I mean, my first teacher had a very powerful transmission, but it all paled in comparison to Andrew. And
yeah,
the only other person I ever felt that kind of power from immediately just by being in the basically literally within 10 feet of this person
yeah, yeah,
was Eckhart, and
yeah.
he had a kind of purity. I mean, I really
Hmm.
think that whatever ego is and pride and all that stuff, it's in some people it just gets burnt out. Ramana was like that, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah, I'm sure there's others. I don't know. I don't know enough about Aurobindo to say one way or the other. But you feel that at Eckhart,
Yeah,
and they had a couple of interviews, and Andrew always had a huge regard for him
yeah,
in his attainment. But they couldn't have had a more different philosophy. And
exactly.
it was very interesting. Once Andrew kind of speculated, if you know a little about Eckhart, the way he came to his awakening was through attempted suicide,
Through suffering.
through
Yeah,
enormous suffering. He
yeah,
struggled with pain and depression and suicide. He was on the edge of blowing his brains out, sitting on the side of his bed,
yeah.
and then he started to feel something come over him, and a voice just said, "Resist nothing," and then he blacked out, and then he woke up the next morning the way he is now.
Yeah,
But
amazing.
he was always much more aligned with the traditional Eastern teaching. This is Maya, and
Yeah,
this is your pain body, and you want to be
yeah,
free from it. And it was always
exactly.
later he started writing a little about the sort of more universal dimensions of it, but it was always ultimately still personal enlightenment.
But I think nowadays he is also talking, which I find surprising, about the manifestation and visualization and manifestation, like that you manifest with your thoughts and this kind of thing. So his teaching, I think, has developed.
Yeah, and Andrew
But
was very different. But Andrew was very different, and Andrew's experience.
totally,
He was I mean, yeah, he had rough parts in the background, but more or less he grew up as a optimistic, upper middle class Jewish kid in New York. Energy,
yeah,
and I spent lots of time in New York, and I know a lot of those New York Jewish types. Like just
yeah,
smart, driven,
yeah,
intelligent, ambitious. Energy, 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 right? And so that was Andrew.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it was just amazing to
totally,
see how the two different worldviews, like Aurobindo and Ramana,
yeah,
it's almost a literal comparison. You could have the same kind of grounded realization, and then your humanity, however, it interprets and understands it in different directions.
yeah.
That's fascinating to me.
We had this idea like a year ago, no, 9 months ago, to create a conference in Auroville where we wanted to bring together Aurobindo and Ramana scholars and teachers and practitioners and try to kind of bridge that gap in a conference. And I find it still a very interesting idea, because for me this is also the bringing together of being and becoming, no? And Andrew did in the last years, the development of his teaching was nothing else than bringing being and becoming closer and closer together as one embrace. And for me, like Ramana and Aurobindo is kind of the being and becoming that could merge
Well,
into
sure.
something
And
higher.
I just started reading Life Divine by Aurobindo, his big sort
Yeah,
of masterwork.
yeah,
It's very difficult to read. I mean, his language is
yes, it
extremely
is.
dense and
Yeah,
convoluted, that old English Oxford sort of that's
yeah,
where he was educated. But um, but this whole idea of that the two need to come, the relative and absolute need to come together in one
yeah,
singular expression of both
yeah, exactly.
is shot through every page, basically.
Yeah,
He had that insight early, and he really, he criticizes, like the section I'm in right now. He talks about the materialist denial of spirit,
yeah.
but then also the spirit denial of material.
Of material.
Life
Yeah,
is
yeah,
Maya. It's all an illusion. It's all a dream.
yeah,
Blah blah blah.
yeah,
And his whole point is they're both denials based on a prejudice.
yeah.
And until those two denials are resolved in a deeper integration, you're not seeing the whole picture. Because
Yes,
in the world is Maya, the world is still pointless. You can still be
yeah.
a nihilist about the world. You can still not care if we blow ourselves up in a nuclear holocaust, because
And
it's
many are. And many are. Here in Tiruvannamalai, like the Advaitin or Neo-Advaitin that speak all about there is no doer and nothing that can be done, then you just pull back and there is no doer. That's it. And that's kind of the end of any attempt of wanting to bring something good into the world. It's just you surrender and that's it.
it's a kind of
But
nihilism. They close
yeah, it is.
it's spiritual nihilism.
Yeah.
There is no purpose. So, all
and
life is
and
like
it
a
lets you
Buddha
off
said,
the hook. It lets you off
lets you
the
off
hook.
the
No
hook.
responsibility. No
You don't have to
responsibility.
really deal with your humanity at all because it's all a dream.
No.
That's the body mind doing
Yeah.
things, you know.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that is
Yeah.
that's and it's interesting to me that in the 40s, Aurobindo wrote so strongly about that. That is a partial view.
Hmm. Yeah.
It by definition, and you don't have to be especially smart to see
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that's partial view, because you're denying, yeah, I was going to say half a reality. I don't know what
yeah, yeah,
percentage of
exactly.
reality the physical reality is, but whatever it
Yeah,
is, you're splitting you're once again splitting the one into
yeah,
two,
yeah,
and it's supposed to be non-duality.
yeah,
And so Aurobindo had that, and Andrew had that in spades, and Eckhart doesn't. Not really.
yeah,
I mean, I think he later on, he kind of, I think, and maybe it was exposure to some of Andrew's, more cosmic teachings, evolutionary teachings he still, but it's still fundamentally, it's a personal enlightenment teaching, and the
yeah,
message
yeah,
is to escape from the suffering and pain of the world. But he came at it from a person who was committing suicide. Andrew came at it with a young man's attitude of curiosity about life,
yeah,
and liking life,
exactly.
and liking being in
Yeah,
life, and being alive,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
having all the things that life brings with it, friendships,
yeah,
relationships, all of
yeah,
it, ups and
yeah,
downs,
yeah, yeah,
and I think that's a much, well, I think two things. A, it's much more reflective of what reality actually is, as we can see, because we can, we're these unique creatures, unlike my dog here. We're these unique creatures who can experience both.
yeah,
Uh, and so then to just, preference one or the other, there's nothing non-dual about it. You can't
yeah,
call that
yeah.
Neo-Advaita stuff non-dual.
No, it's
It's
not.
not non-dual.
Exactly. It's not. Yeah.
By definition, I
And
mean, look, you don't need any mystical insight to see that. You just need
no,
a
no, no.
bit of,
It's obvious. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Do you have any kind of anecdotes that you would want to share that you had with Andrew? Just if something comes spontaneously to your mind.
I think the one, and I may have said this to you the other day. I mean, there's so many, and I'm sure if I asked you that question, you'd just, okay, let me go through my journals and see, because, well, the ones that really stick with you, you don't have to look to your journals.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, there are many, but the one I'll never forget is, I had been involved with him for some years. I was on a retreat in Fox Hollow. I had been involved with him probably 7, 8 years now, so pretty deep in.
Mm-hmm.
As at the level that I was at, sort of practitioner. What I don't remember what the categories were, but I was being taken
Mm-hmm.
very seriously. I'd gone on long retreats. I had lots of real friendships and relationships in the community, and was running centers out here and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was on a retreat with him, and Andrew always encouraged people to go see other spiritual teachers, and
Yeah.
because he was always curious and interested in what other people were teaching. And so I had gone to see somebody out here, and had a very powerful experience with this person, and at that retreat, Andrew always wanted to hear what your experience, his spiritual
Yeah.
experiences. He's always very interested in everybody's spiritual experiences, and
Yeah.
it'll take time to listen in front of 300 people at a retreat. And so I was telling him about what had happened, and he listened very patiently, and then he just looked at me at one point, and I was sitting right up front, and he just looked at me at one point, and and again, he had known me for some time. He knew what kind of experiences I had had and so forth. He goes, but Mike, haven't you had enough grace in your life?
Mm-hmm.
And I literally didn't understand the question, because my
Mm-hmm.
understanding was that you want to have as many spirit experiences of spirit as possible, because that's going to fuel your ongoing transformation, whatever. And I just said, I don't know what you mean. And he just looked at me, and again, it was one of those moments where it was no longer banter,
Yeah.
but it was just direct,
Yeah.
like eye to eye. You
Yeah.
know what I'm talking about, man? That conduit is
Totally.
there. His eyes are in your eyes, and it's just a dead serious question. And he just looked at me, and he goes, "But Mike, do you know what the truth is?"
Yeah.
And I was just like, I felt like a butterfly that got pinned to a board. It's like, okay, you cannot escape from this question with clever
Yeah.
postmodern workarounds. Well, what do you mean by truth? What is truth? Da 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 da.
No, no, no.
No, it's just a no bullshit man-to-man question, right? Do you know
Yeah.
what the truth is? And he knew the experiences I had, so I had to say, yes, I do.
Yeah.
That was a weird thing to say, because you're not
Yeah.
supposed to ever admit that you know something in the spiritual world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I had to say, yes, I do. He goes, then when are you going to stop seeking and get
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
with the process of purification?
Yeah.
And in that moment, something just completely flipped in me. And the whole idea of seeking more spiritual experience, literally, it just died right there to this
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
And now I don't seek, I sit to meditate because I want to deepen my
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
What I already know is under all the turbulence, right? Um, but it just ended something in me. And I was like, wow, he's telling me I'm a finder and I need to own it.
yeah,
And I'm sure you've heard
yeah,
that many
exactly.
times. Own
Oh,
it,
yeah,
own it,
yeah.
own
Own
it.
it and live up to it. Do
And
something
that's the
with it.
thing.
Live
Get on
up
with
to
the
it.
process of
Exactly.
purification. Get on with
Exactly.
the process
Yeah,
of purification.
yeah,
You know, why keep coming to God like a beggar with your hands open
yeah,
like this? You know, when I
yeah,
feel you, I'll stand for you. When I don't feel you, well, you never know. You know?
yeah, yeah. I think that's one of one of the strongest parts of his teachings, this encouragement that we become experience independent, that enough is enough. You need experiences, but then you want to become experience independent. You know the truth, you want to live up to the truth, if you feel it or not.
And
I find that so
yeah.
encouraging.
And the other thing that kind of goes with that, now that I'm thinking back about it, is the whole teaching about the experience of enlightenment and the perspective of enlightenment. And you know, and he always said, you know, the experiences are going to come and go. That's what
Yeah,
experiences do.
yeah,
So if spirit for you is an experience, it's going to come and go.
yeah,
But and then he went, you know, on some of these retreats, he went to great lengths. But what is when you're in the experience? What is the perspective
yeah,
that you're holding
yeah,
naturally,
yeah,
that you're in, that you, it's not even you're holding it, it was thrust on you because you're
yeah,
having an experience. At that moment, you want to be free more than anything else,
yeah,
right? At that moment, you want to really know and face everything, right? All those
yeah,
things. At that
yeah,
moment,
yeah, yeah.
you see the radical impersonality of everything. At that moment, you want to live for the sake of the whole that you just recognize
Yeah.
you are.
Beautiful.
uh,
Exactly.
And so I was just like, oh, wow, that was a complete reconfiguration for me. Because it's like in
Yeah,
those many moments when I don't feel especially enlightened, that's where the teaching was so powerful. Then you can adopt this perspective.
yeah,
And then he
so
always
true.
would point us, really, what's the difference between the person who's acting enlightened in the world, whatever that means, and the one who actually is?
Yeah,
It was a very interesting question. Is it all feeling dependent? Or is there a deeper substratum and a scaffolding? So I always saw the teaching as like building a scaffolding around yourself
yeah,
that allows you to hold the perspective. And if you're holding the perspective, that experience is going to come visit you more often
yeah,
because the
exactly.
structures are there, you know? It's just like having air
And it's
conditioning.
no, exactly. And it's subtle because you need deep experiences and you can feel it in other people if the experience have been there at one point, because then you feel the grounding of the person. But you don't need the constant repetition of the experiences. At one point you are just grounded in this knowing, in this deep trust, and in the perspective, as you say, and that gives you the guidelines to
Yeah,
move forward.
and then you know, and then you find out all the areas where you got to change, where you're not holding that
Yeah,
perspective, you know, and then it's
yeah.
so that was the radical coherence of Andrew's teaching
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that brought together like every aspect. You know, obviously the whole shadow bit was not in the picture at all because it's a shadow, and you know, that we discovered with painful consequences about all that, but that's not
Yeah.
really what this is all about. But you know, and then even like after everything fell apart and you know, I was involved, my marriage fell apart and I got involved in a new relationship. And that person who I'm still involved with now, she just has zero interest in any of this. And she would kind of look at me
Mm,
sometimes and she kind of pushed me, you know, in a way that I found annoying at times, but she wasn't wrong. Which is like if I would, you know, that we would be out together and I would do something like act impatiently or be angry or just, you know, the usual kind of irritated things that we all do in life, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
she goes, well, you know, what did you learn all that? Because I don't see it. I just see you as just and she was, you know, she was right. And I had a
Well,
very funny thing that a friend of mine said. I was out with him and then he's like a, you know, he's this brother from the hood, as we say over here. He's this black guy who lives near me and, you know, is different, very different background than me. And we became very good friends, especially during the pandemic. We always worked out together.
mhm.
I told him about all this stuff. And I don't know, one day we were driving along and you know, I got a little bit of temper in traffic or something. He goes, man, I thought you did all that meditation and all that stuff, man. What's up with you? I said, well, you know, he goes, I think, he says, I think you ought to get your money back. because it didn't take. So,
Yeah,
so then
there you have
in
it.
real life, all our deeper experiences are always faced with that part of ourselves,
Yeah, yeah.
and I had to take that very seriously. Like, what impact did all of this really have? And that is the ongoing grappling, to
Yeah,
this day with, the absolute realizations you certainly have had,
mhm.
and the relative life that you're still living, and then the intersection of all that with the ego that you need to function in the world, and all your little neuroses and everything else, and that's work in progress. And
Yeah.
what I found out later, both also through Andrew, is that's probably kind of a work in progress for everybody, including the enlightened person, unless you're a Ramana type who just sits back and lets people feed him and radiates the power that he's kind of merged into to those around him without any further doing.
Yeah, yeah, and he had a temper too. When you hear the stories here, he seemed to have had a temper too. So my conclusion of all of this is that it's probably really the really rare person that can completely dissolve the ego and doesn't have all this.
Well, and I even wonder, even if your ego is completely dissolved, does that mean you're never going to get angry? You know,
Good question. I don't know.
why
Yeah,
would it? Life is full of
yeah,
things that should make you angry, right?
yeah, that's
I read
true.
something. I read something recently, and this is some about Eckhart. Actually, it was apparently he was preparing to give a talk somewhere, big venue. I don't know. Something got screwed up in terms of some of the logistics of the event got
Hmm.
screwed up, and he lost his temper with somebody. And then somebody had to write an article. Oh, he claims to be enlightened, but look, he lost his temper.
Mm.
This kind
Hmm.
of insane spiritual idea
Yeah,
that
yeah.
if you're a spiritual person, you're always going to speak in a soft voice. You always want to give people a long hug. You know,
Hmm.
Nothing is going to ruffle you because it's just such a fairy tale. And
Yeah,
people who
yeah.
act
It
like
is.
that are pretenders. You shouldn't trust people like that.
Yeah, yeah,
But that was oh yeah, and then that Eckhart story, apparently he went back afterwards and apologized to the person and just said, look,
yeah,
just because I do this doesn't mean I don't have all these other human things too. And
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
so that's just an open, interesting. But the point being, the in terms of the spiritual path practice, that thing about it's a perspective as much as it is an experience, gave you something real that you could hang on to without ever having to wait for a perspective for an experience to come along again. That was so powerful. That just gave me a framework, and still does,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
for dealing with the parts of myself that are, quote unquote, less enlightened. And I'm not claiming anything about enlightenment anyway. I'm just sharing how my perspective
No,
on
no,
shifted
I
so
totally understand
dramatically.
what you're saying. I don't hear you claim anything, but that's how Andrew talked, and we want to, yeah, we want to live up to the experience that we had, and the insights and the openings, and take it from there. And there is no end to that. The development goes on and on and on,
That's right. And
and we can just become bigger and bigger and bigger in the embrace of the totality of reality, whatever that means in the
well, yeah, and
complexity of
that's
the
a,
world today.
and if it's true that it's all infinite, which it seems to be, then
Yeah,
infinite by definition means no end. That is what it means.
exactly.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah,
and our finite minds just you can't. It's infinite is an inconceivable concept in the
yeah,
mind,
yeah,
and if you when you feel it, when you feel it opening up in yourself, also it can be terrifying because you
yeah,
seem to know boundaries. You don't really know how to locate yourself in that
yeah,
anymore, other than just
yeah,
letting go. That is the
yeah,
location. That is the
exactly. Yeah,
and everything in our upbringing and training and culture doesn't support that. So these kind of
yeah,
refined, rarefied opportunities to be with people like Andrew, like yourself, and others, it's precious, and that's why the whole
yeah,
thing
it
happened
is.
at the end. It's also heartbreaking. It's also devastatingly heartbreaking
Yeah.
how it all ended. But even that is just filled with lessons about the nature of all this, of enlightenment, of development, and
And I find it so interesting, Mike, like after Andrew's passing away, quite a few people reconnect with me with Alka, and what seems to be obvious is that the deep connection, the soul connection, or the deep love connection, as you described it so beautifully, is it's just still there. It's a bond that is there, and if we don't neglect it, if we don't push it away, but just open ourselves up, it's right there, and that's where we connect.
Well, I
And
feel
we
the truth
know
of
it.
that.
We
Yep,
know it when we feel it. No, it's
yep.
like it's obvious.
The truth of that, I like I said to you in the conversation the other day, or somebody, um, I feel like with Andrew passing, that thing that you said about him passing on his 39th anniversary of his enlightenment,
Yeah,
and and then also when you said, I didn't know he had a heart attack and a stroke. I mean, it's so
yeah,
devastating
yeah,
that, I mean, it was just what happened to him. It was just it was almost like his body made sure there was no coming back.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, it looks like this.
it was just like Gordian knot, bam.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
now all the anger that was directed at Andrew, he's not here anymore.
yeah,
And whatever karma he's got as an individual with all the stuff, all the bad things that happened, that's on him. He's going to have to, I don't know, and what I have no idea what's next, but if there's karma and all that stuff, then that's on him. He's going
yeah,
to have to deal with that. But we're left with the jewel
yeah,
now, and we don't have to
yeah,
deal anymore with the difficulty of Andrew at his worst moments. We
yeah,
talk about his best moments. He definitely had his worst moments too.
yeah, yeah,
Like all of us. Just his had a bigger impact because he was playing on a bigger level, much
yeah.
bigger. But
Yeah, and we can allow ourselves to just connect in the deepest place and in the most
that's
beautiful
it.
place.
That's what I said. His
That is
body
always
died,
there, no? Yeah,
but I literally within that week, I literally felt him, and this is something that's with me every day. I felt like he's sitting, that little image of a Buddha sitting in the lotus of your heart. I mean, I feel
yeah,
like that's where Andrew is sitting right now. He
beautiful.
died out here and he came to life again in here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In the purest part of what he was trying to transmit, and not
Hmm.
all the other stuff. And I think that must be happening for other people too, because the psycho-emotional difficulty of having to deal with him as a personality is no longer here.
Yeah,
Once and for all and forever. It's gone. He's
yeah,
cremated. He's gone. But that is left. And who carry
yeah,
some us who carry some of that.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I feel like
Exactly.
there's an opportunity for a kind of a rebirth that could be smooth and organic and non-dramatic,
Yeah,
and not so much like even explosive as evolutionary. Evolution often doesn't happen it's these,
yeah, yeah.
you know
I hear
um
what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, that feels good. It's kind of an organic unfolding that could happen now that probably wasn't possible when he
not as
was
long as
still
Andrew
here.
was around.
Yeah.
He was too much of a hot button. What did I read somewhere? There was some people talking about maybe bringing him back to the integral world, but they still thought it was too soon, needed to wait a
No, no,
couple.
Layman said that in the conversation with me.
Oh, yeah, 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 right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
he was
No,
still
no, that was a big
radioactive as a
thing.
brand, right? I mean, absolutely
Totally.
radioactive, but
Yeah,
that's gone. It's gone.
yeah, yeah,
Now the only thing left is those of us who were touched by him, and there's an enormous body of work that he left, and it's enormous.
yeah, yeah,
That's why I feel very passionate about finding a way to enshrine some, at least as much of that as
yeah.
possible, to leave a significant body of work for future generations. Just like
Mm,
I can go read Aurobindo now. I'm sure if back in Aurobindo's day they'd had all the digital recording technologies and everything we have, we'd have a huge archive of Aurobindo or Ramakrishna
yeah, yeah. True.
or Ramana or any of these people, But this is the generation where we have that. And
Yeah,
Andrew's attainment, in my opinion, was no different in terms of magnitude than any of those guys.
I
So,
agree.
you know, and again, that all gets washed out. But maybe now through conversations like this one, that can be brought back up
Yeah,
without
yeah. I'm all up for that.
you know,
Is there anything else you would like to add? It feels like we probably come to a natural end here,
yeah, I mean, it's an
unless
hour and a half. It's a long time. Oh, I could just go on,
I
but
could
yeah,
do.
I just think it's like I said before, I feel extraordinarily blessed to have been part of his drama,
Mm.
you know, and for him to be part of mine, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, presuming I live a few more years, I would really like to be part of whatever the post-Andrew evolutionary enlightenment scene might be.
Yeah,
In terms
let's
of,
find out.
you know, let's find out exactly. I like what
Yeah,
you said the other day, instead of jumping so quickly to
yeah,
do right now, you know. I mean, and I've thought about it since our last conversation. I mean, for me, it's that novel. That
yeah,
would be my offering to the world. And if there's,
yeah.
when
That
there's three
sounds
that I have
amazing.
in mind, I'm working on the first one. There's three that it's a trilogy I have in mind.
Yeah,
But that's why I'm selling my business and retiring, so I can just do this. This is my spiritual practice right now. Um,
wonderful.
so
I'm very curious about that book.
yeah,
Thank you so
I'm
much.
so I'm so impatient to get it done.